Okay? There's no way for you to prove to me that it didn't happen. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that in a couple of minutes. And so the question is not, which one can you prove? The question is, which one is the likeliest or the most probable explanation of what took place? Okay? Does that make sense? Now, in your heart, you might say, okay, I'm absolutely convinced that is flat out cool. You cannot prove to a skeptic beyond a shadow of a doubt that it happened. If they don't want to believe, you can't prove it to them. Right? They cannot prove to you that it did happen, that it didn't happen. They can't do it. Don't have the capacity. What I'm going to tell you is that their explanation of what took place is way harder to believe than what we believe as Jesus followers. That's going to be my point. All right? And we're going to get back to that in a second, because we're going to kind of come back to it in a little even more macro level than that. Do you have anything on that, Ben? Now, a decision, your decision as to whether or not you're going to buy it or not, is probably the biggest decision you'll ever make. Okay? And you will make a decision. Because the way this thing works is, not voting equals a no vote. For it or not. And when you're talking about or not, I'm just talking about whether you blow it off or whether or not you actively oppose. If Jesus is God, and if he came down here to do something for all of us, and he went through that, and you blow him off, I mean, there's no other alternatives. You either stand, you vote for, or you are against, whether you vote or not, once you are confronted. And here's why it's a big deal. If Jesus was right, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, and if what he said about himself is true, then how you judge Jesus will determine how God judges you. And if there's a God, you should care about that. Does that make sense? If there is no God, who gives a rip? But if there is a God, and Jesus is the Son of God, and if God judges us based on how we judge him, then this is a big deal. It doesn't get any bigger. Okay? And you got to make a call. Because no call is a no call. Does that make sense? Okay? And I believe, seriously, that this puts into perspective every other struggle that you're going through. Whether it's a relational struggle, a financial struggle, a physical struggle, anything else. Anything else you are going through pales in significance to your decision on this. Any other decision you're struggling to make pales by comparison with your decision regarding this. Okay? That's my starting point. What do you got to say? Anything on that? All right, you see, I told you I'm going to finish on time. Now, this is not about the Jesus that many people fantasize about. I mean, if you ask people who Jesus was, 100 people are going to give you 100 different answers. And too often what's going to happen is that they have basically morphed Jesus into something that they're comfortable with. Okay? You don't have the right to recreate Jesus into your image or your desires. He either was and has to be taken seriously as he was, or he doesn't matter. But you don't get to say, my kind of Jesus wouldn't do this. My kind of Jesus wouldn't think this way. My kind of Jesus wouldn't act this way. Okay? My kind of Jesus would do this for me. My kind of Jesus would do this, right? He would punish those that I dislike or something like that. You can't do that. We're talking about the Jesus of history. You don't get to recreate who he was, what he said, what he did. We don't get to recreate, to morph him into something we're more comfortable with. Okay? The real Jesus made claims that were so arrogant demands that were so outrageous and promises that were so wild that you just cannot blow him off. You've either got to bend your knees or go to war. Those are your two options. The real Jesus doesn't leave you other options. This takes you right back to a very, very famous little formula by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said, based on this, claims so arrogant, demands so outrageous, promises so wild, that you can either dismiss him as the craziest lunatic ever. Because anybody who said the kind of stuff Jesus said and believed it and it wasn't true is crazy and needs to be locked up. Someone around you says, I'm God, and if you bend your knees to me, I'll get you into heaven, and if I forgive you, your sins are forgiven. If that guy isn't God, lock him up. He's crazy. He's dangerous to your kids. He's dangerous to your friends. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? He made claims so arrogant, demands so outrageous. He basically said this, you're going to have to love me more than you love your wife and your kids. You're going to have to love me more than you love your own life. Okay? Unless you deny yourself, take up your cross, which means whatever it costs you, and follow me, you're not in. Now that is a demand that's outrageous. Ben is senior minister, and he says, unless you love me more than you love your spouse, fire him. Okay? Right? Anybody who makes a claim like that is a man, makes a claim like that. If he believes it, he's a lunatic. If he knows that he's scamming you, he is an incredible liar. An outrageous liar. Because he is putting people's souls on the line, and he knows it. This is the greatest scam artist of all time. He made promises that are so wild. If you follow me, I will save you, both in this life and forever. No matter what it costs you, no matter how they hurt you, if you follow me, I've got your back forever. Okay? Claims so arrogant, demands so outrageous, promises so wild. You can't treat him with apathy. You've either got to dismiss him as a lunatic, hope that he's locked up or killed, turn your back on him as a liar, and hope that he's dead now. Because if Jesus, goodness gracious, guys, if you'd say no to him, you better hope he stayed dead. Right? Because if he rose from the dead and you haven't bent your knees, you're in trouble. And that's it. Or you can abandon yourself to him as your Lord. And there's no other reasonable options. Only God can demand that you worship him as God. Any man that demands that you worship him as God, respect him as God, follow him as God, needs to be pushed aside. Right? Any man doing this stuff, I'm glad he's dead. If he came back, that changes the equation a whole lot, doesn't it? Okay? Now, anything you want to add there?
So one of the interesting themes, we've been doing this sermon series called Red Letters. And the whole concept of what we're doing, this is actually a trend that Doc's done for years. But leading up to Easter, we like to do a sermon series just focused in on the person of Jesus, who he is, that kind of stuff. The nature of this specific series, one of the recurring themes that just keeps popping up is this misunderstanding of who Jesus is. And you can see it in the narratives that come from the Gospels and how especially the religious leaders are interacting with him and it's not making sense. You can see it there very plainly. But you can also see it as we've worked through this within our own culture and our own experiences. Quite frequently, people will walk away from the misrepresentation of Jesus more than they actually walk away from Jesus. And that's come up several times. We've had some serious moments within our sermons the last few weeks dealing with who is Jesus actually and walking through some of that kind of stuff. It's going to come up again this upcoming Sunday. We're going to go back to that big theme idea. It's over and over and over again. Quite frequently, people who are comfortable with Jesus without worshiping with Jesus have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is. People who are uncomfortable with Jesus have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is. most of the time. Okay,
Well,
there's a respect aspect to that, and kind of the God fearing God kind of a thing at times. But most oftentimes, when people turn away the church, or whenever people walk away from Jesus and the person of Him, it's because He's been misrepresented. Is a very, very common thing. In fact, years ago there was a trend. I have 2 books on my shelf written by 2 different people with the same title, and the title is "They Like Jesus, but They Don't Like the Church." And it's written about people who are open to the idea of Jesus, but they've been turned away because of Christians. The way that Christians have behaved, the way that Christians have represented Jesus has made them walk away from Jesus to a certain extent. The flip side of that is that they also have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is. I mean, it's a complicated issue to just blame it on Christians. But nonetheless, this is the common theme over and over and over again. Quite frequently, we have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is, and then it messes up how we interact with that person moving forward.
I believe it was Rick Warren. He wrote The Purpose-Driven Church, The Purpose-Driven Life. You may have heard that. He was one of my heroes. He retired not too long ago, but he was a pastor over at Saddleback Church out in Orange County, California. But he said that oftentimes he would engage with people and they would say, I just hate Jesus. It was him who said, tell me about this Jesus you hate, because I'm probably going to hate him too. Because the fact is, people have so many twisted ideas about Jesus that oftentimes he's just a bogeyman, not the real Jesus. So we're talking about the real Jesus. Now, the next step in this little path that I'm going to take you on is right here. And this is from Andy Stanley, who's a pastor down that a lot of people hate down in Atlanta, but I think he's really quite bright. Okay? Andy Stanley puts it like this. He says, if a man predicts his death, that's not all that hard. Okay? I've got a lot of predictions about how I'm going to die. Okay? I've got some likely ones. Some of them have to do with driving.
Do any of them have to do with me?
Some of them have. Yeah. Since he has come on board, a lot of accidents have happened. Okay? If a man predicts his death, that's not unusual. And his resurrection. He says, I'm not going to stay dead. Right? And if he pulls it off, maybe you should listen to him. Now the question is, did Jesus really do this? This is what the Bible says. The Bible says that he predicted his death, and not like me, kind of rating the ideas of which is the most likely one to kill me, right? But actually just saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, right? This is how they're going to arrest me. This is how they're going to put me on trial. This is how they're going to beat me. This is how they're going to flog me, and then they're going to crucify me, and in 3 days I'll be back. Now, if a guy actually pulls that off, that's weird, right? That's enough to get you to sit up and say, well, at least I better give him a pretty serious listening on that. That's the way Stanley puts it. I think he's right. So how do you know? How can we say that this is the more probable than it didn't happen? Because that's kind of where we are this evening, okay? Is this likely actually to have taken place? That Jesus actually did predict his death, predict his resurrection, and pull it off. Is that likely? Okay? Now, one of the things that I'm going to do at the outset is I'm going to try to unstack the deck. Because a lot of people that you deal with are going to stack the deck. They're going to say it couldn't have happened because I don't think there's a God. Right? And I'm telling you guys, if there's no God, it probably didn't happen. That sways it entirely. When I was at Emory, on one of my degree programs, one of the things that they were drilling into us is that you have to reckon seriously with the possibility, in fact, the likelihood in their minds that there is no God, which means the miracles of Jesus are just superstitions, right? If you start with the probability that there is no God, any explanation of resurrection beats the one in the scriptures. All of them do. If there is no God, it couldn't have happened. So there's got to be something weird that took place. And no matter how weird it is, it beats the fact that a miracle took place. And so one of the things that I had to learn at the outset was to unstack the deck. If you stack the deck, it always loses. It's going to lose every time. But I'm going to go back to the same place where I started. I can't prove to you that there's a God. You cannot TP me. Ben put these slides together in my office using my computer with my hands.
Again.
Yeah, that was slick. You cannot prove to me that there is not a God. You can't. Okay? Which is more rational, that there is a God or not? Now, there are people out there just automatically jump to the conclusion there's no God. Why? Because if there was a God, he would do this. Because we have a notion if there is a God, he's going to do things my way. And if he doesn't do things my way, then there's no God, which is stupid. Okay? That's stacking the deck. That's assuming that you're God and that you got your minds wrapped around God. Okay? So a lot of people just dismiss the notion. I haven't seen a miracle, they can't happen. Okay? He doesn't fix this, there can't be a God, because if there was a God, he'd fix this. If there was a God, my kid wouldn't die. If there was a God, we wouldn't have the financial issues that we're having, right? And so they stack the deck in that fashion and saying, because he doesn't meet my little criteria, there's no God. Stacking the deck. I'm going to go back to the very, very basics. I'm going to go back to a guy named G.K. Chesterton who wrote this thing 120 years ago, a long time ago, all right? G.K. Chesterton was one of C.S. Lewis's heroes, okay? One of the guys he read and honored most. And this is what he said, and I changed this word, okay, to make it a little bit more adaptable. He used another term which isn't useful today. But he said, it is absurd for a person who's an atheist. It's ridiculous for an atheist to say it's unthinkable for God to make everything out of nothing. Where he come from, the kind of thing that you would say. It's unthinkable for an atheist to say, how could there be a God who just creates everything? Okay? Makes no sense to them. And then pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything. What do you think is more likely? That this universe popped into existence on its own out of nothing, or that there's a God? One of them is kind of magic. That's all it is magic. Okay? That everything that is simply popped into existence on its own. In my mind, it is more rational to say that there is something that is not like this universe. There is something that is by definition eternal, which is the only reason that anything that is not eternal can come into existence. Something unlike this has to exist for something like this to come into existence. That's what he's saying. Does that make sense? Okay? So I'm not going to accept this idea to start with. I'm going to say, okay, let's say there's a possibility that there's a God, which I think is way more rational than the alternative, and there's a possibility that there's no God. Without stacking the deck, let's just look at what happened and see what makes the most sense out of what we see. Okay? I'm not going to pre-stack the deck and say there's no God, so it couldn't have happened. That to me is dumb. We're going to reckon with equal possibilities, which to me are not equal. Okay? Let's say that the miracles are possible. Jesus could have been the Son of God. If there is a God, then the whole idea, if there is a God and you think that miracles aren't possible, if there is a God and that resurrection is not possible, then you've got a puny God. A God who's capable of bringing the universe into existence out of nothing probably would find it child's play to raise someone from the dead. Does that make sense? If there's a God, resurrection is not hard. In fact, if you think there's a God and you think resurrection is hard, your view of God is weird. It's not big enough. Okay? You got anything on that, Ben?
No, that was the problem that the disciples had.
Huh?
That was the problem the disciples had.
Yes.
Because they believed in a God, and they had Jesus himself tell them how much he was going to die and resurrect. And even when it happened, they didn't believe it.
So the next piece is to say, okay, did it actually, what are the evidences? Classically, and guys have been talking about this, guys, for centuries and millennia. Classically, there are three kinds of evidence that we're talking about when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, right? One of them is physical evidence, another one is eyewitness evidence, and the other one is circumstantial evidence. All of them the kinds of evidences that you might present in a court of law today. Physical evidences, right? Eyewitness evidences, and circumstantial evidences. And I'm just going to walk through them real fast. Okay? There's a lot more. There's volumes written on this stuff, guys. Okay? Physical evidence. You got an empty tomb. There is really no dispute by the people who study this stuff seriously, either by the ones who believe in Jesus and the ones who don't believe in Jesus. All of them agree there was an empty tomb. The fact is, the tomb was full, the tomb became empty. Okay? Something had to empty it. The disciples launched a scam. That's a possibility. We looked at that one, which is as laughable as the sketch in my mind. Okay? It would be the dumbest scam in the history of the world. We'll get back to that, all right? Or the Jews stole the body, which means that a few weeks later when the disciples were on the street corners preaching that Jesus was raised from the dead, the simplest way to stop this thing in the tracks would be to drag the body out and say, look. Okay? The Romans stole the body. Why? Okay? And there's some other little explanations. There's explanations like, well, maybe Jesus wasn't really dead. Maybe they beat him nearly to death, crucified him, stuck a sword in his side till the blood and water poured out, went into the tomb and the cool air revived him, and he rolled away the stone and eluded the soldiers and then convinced all of his disciples that he was alive. That makes sense to you? Okay? That's another possibility. Okay? And so, but the fact is the tomb is empty. I mean, this is not hard. Here's the deal. If they started preaching the resurrection years later, then you could have gone to the tomb, and because there wasn't any way to preserve the body, evidence would be gone. Right? But they started preaching Jesus on Pentecost. Pentecost is 7 weeks after Passover. 7 weeks later, they're on the street corners of Jerusalem telling the people who killed Jesus that God raised him from the dead. Right? They wanted to stop this thing, pull out a body. The tomb was empty. The enemies never denied that it was empty. They just tried coming up with an explanation for there being an empty tomb, the one we saw in the Babylon Bee. Okay? The tomb's empty. I mean, the other things about the story, there's some story that I've got. Let me see, what else did I do? It's the next slide, I think. Oh, it's right there. Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. I ought to look at my notes. It was discovered by women. I went over this on Sunday, if you were here on Sunday. Okay? To us, that doesn't raise an eyelash at all. Back then, that's the weirdest thing in the world, because women didn't count as witnesses in that world. And nobody inventing a resurrection story would start with his being found by a woman. They didn't count. Now, I know that's rude. It's not my rude, it's theirs. Right? Whether you were Jewish, Greek, Roman, women wouldn't be the witnesses. It's a weird detail. Number two is that people who study legend, and there are people who do this professionally, they study fairy tales and legends. They just how they are developed, how they start, how they grow, all of these kinds of things. They say there are no marks of legend in the resurrection stories in the New Testament. Wouldn't you like to know exactly what it looked like when that stone was rolled away, what it sounded like? Wouldn't you like to know what happened to the Roman soldiers who were supposed to be guarding it? Wouldn't you like to know what Jesus looked like? right? All of those kind of details that if I were filming the resurrection, I would make it majestic. I'd have all those details in it. If they were telling stories, they would supply all those details. The simplicity of the account is stunning. It has no marks of legend in the story. They went to the tomb, the stone is rolled away, there's an angel there who tells them he's not here, go away, right? And that's it. We want a lot more detail. If you want detail, go to some of the later Christian writings, some of the Christian Apocrypha. They're fun. One of the Christian Apocrypha talks about when Jesus rose from the dead. He walked out of the tomb. He was way taller than the angels. His head reached up into the sky, and it gives all of those kind of details. It's fun. It's fanciful. It's ridiculous. It's Hollywood, but it's not history. The accounts are simple, unembellished, and all the accounts differ in minor details. Now, some people say, uh-oh, they differ. How can it be true? And let me just throw something at you. Okay, I can remember as a kid, we saw a UFO. It wasn't really. It was just something came flying through our neighborhood that we couldn't figure out, right? Had no idea what it was. And it was flying low. It was flying slow. It kind of floated over our houses. And all of the neighbors were out there looking at it. My whole family, and there's a boatload of us. There were 7 kids in my family, besides my mom and dad. So we were all out there, okay?
If you're unable to identify it, that does make it unidentified.
That is true.
That does make it a
wasn't
UFO.
unidentified. There was an explanation. I don't know what it was. But I remember when my dad got us in the house, he said, now all of you either draw a picture of it or write a description of what you saw. Every description was different. Okay? Every one of them had different details and some of the details clashed. We'd all just watched it, stepped inside, and recorded it. Right? What would happen if the 7 of us kids went in and our descriptions were identical? What conclusion would you draw?
You conspired a story.
We conspired a story, and I got all of our stories together. Real life doesn't work that way. When people are interrogated by the police, if the stories are too close to each other, then you know that they have collaborated and got their stories straight together. Right? In real life, when people describe something, they're going to emphasize different pieces. Little tiny pieces are going to be in different order. It's going to clash. I tried this when I was a college prof. I'd go in and say, okay, you were all here the last time. Tell me exactly what happened in class last time we were here. And the accounts would always be very different. Now, they would all be revolving around a central theme. You could gain the story from the accounts, but you would never find identical details. This is a mark of the fact that this story was not on the basis of collaboration, but you have independent eyewitnesses. This is what this tells you. There are independent eyewitnesses to the resurrection stories. Okay? Fact is, there's an empty tomb. That's a physical evidence. Tomb was empty. We get that from several different eyewitnesses that the tomb was empty. We get it from the fact that it was never disputed by the enemies. They came up with explanations as to why the tomb might be empty. But never did anybody volunteer to go to the tomb and say, look, there's the stone, let's roll it back and let's find the body. They couldn't do that. That's number one, physical evidence. Did I miss anything?
You didn't speak a whole lot to this point, but the idea of them stealing the body doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially the video that we started with. People don't die for lies, typically. Especially the larger the group, the less likely they are all to hold the story. Someone will break. And so you've got the idea that if the body was stolen, if these men who didn't really see a resurrected Jesus, they sure seemed very willing to die for what it is they claimed they saw. So for them to have not seen that but still all be willing to die for that claim is preposterous. And again, you've already covered the idea that maybe Jesus didn't actually die. I can remember that was a big press a while back, and
Swoon theory.
it's why it's very interesting that Luke even adds some of the details he does about the spear going in and the blood and the water. That's a medical thing that happened in that moment. That's really significant. Regardless, even if he doesn't die, it's pretty implausible to imagine him having the strength to do anything about it 3 days later.
It's crazy.
So, yeah, you've covered all that.
Next is the eyewitness evidence. And there's a boatload of them, guys. What I did here, and I don't know that you can read this, you probably can't, okay? But this was just pretty easy to find. I went through and tried to find a chart. This is the biggest one I can find that shows the number of people that Jesus appeared to, okay? Starts out with Mary Magdalene. That's the one that I talked about Sunday. Mary Magdalene and another Mary. Before anything else happened, he appears to Mary and a couple of the other ladies. To Peter, Clopas, and an unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus. That's what you're going to talk about Sunday, I believe.
But I won't mention his name. I'll just refer to the two guys. So
Gotcha. To the 11 and those with them, plus these guys. Thomas was not present. To the 11 with Thomas. To Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, John, and 2 other unnamed disciples. These are all different accounts. The 11 disciples, more than 500 brothers and sisters, Christian Jesus followers at one time. James, the brother of Jesus, the 11 and again, and then later on to Paul. Those are the ones that are recorded. We know that Jesus was around for about 40 days before ascending back to the Father. All right? During that time, he was prepping his disciples for what was coming. These are the stories that we know about. I have no illusion that this is all that took place. Okay? In other words, there were a bunch of them. And they walked with him. They talked with him. They touched him. They ate with him. We're talking physical interactions. We're not talking about a sighting of some Sasquatch in the distance. Oh, was that Jesus? Right? They're not talking about kind of an ethereal presence where they thought, was that Jesus? They're talking about sitting right there eating dinner with us. Okay? That's very, very important. Hallucination, some people have suggested these aren't appearances, these are hallucinations. Number one, nobody in that world had an expectation that Jesus was back. Nobody would be hallucinating something that was never on anybody's mind. It's a dumb explanation, okay? And when you have the repeated hallucination of the same thing by so many people over time, you're getting to the realm of the ludicrous.
And typically, people don't share hallucinations together.
No, they don't.
That tends to be an individual experience.
Give enough people a bunch of mushrooms, and they're probably going to have slightly different stories. Does that make sense? They're likely not all going to see the same thing. That's, I think, your point. Is that the way when you ate the mushrooms, it was always different?
Don't worry about it.
Here's the bottom line. Boatloads of people. And we don't have a record of one saying we made it up. Okay? Jews have no record of one of them saying we made it up. You've got these disciples going out and preaching, and as they said in the Babylon Bee sketch, they went out and preached Jesus for the rest of their life, which was sometimes short because every single one of them was killed for their witness, except for John, who was exiled on an island and spent the rest of his life in exile, which is why he was an old man writing stuff like probably the book of Revelation. Okay? He was old, but he was in exile for Jesus. None of these guys backed off. Now, if it's a scam, and here's the deal, okay, if it's a scam, if we make up this story, how stupid is it to die before you confess what you've done? This is Charles Colson. This is pretty good. This is the way, any of you old guys remember Charles Colson? Any of you guys remember something called Watergate? All right. One of the big scandals, presidential scandals back with Nixon, okay? And Colson was right in the heart of that scandal.
Was that in the 1900s?
It was in the 1900s. And basically, they broke into an apartment to steal stuff that was harmful to the president, and they had a group of guys, right? And it was quite the scandal. It eventually brought him down. But Colson, who was one of those guys who turned out to be a Christian, a fierce Christian, who's done magnificent work for the kingdom, he said, I know the resurrection's a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they'd seen Jesus raised from the dead, proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Every one was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured it if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 10 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. He's right. Okay? The fact that all of the apostles went to their death proclaiming what they had seen and touched. How are you going to account for that if there was no resurrection? How do you account for it? What makes sense? Okay? If I'm trying to I try to pull fast ones on people a lot, guys. I really do, right? But if it's going to end up biting me, I eventually fess up so I don't suffer the consequences. None of them did. And the consequences they suffered was unimaginable. Peter crucified upside down, right? Not denying it. He wouldn't. It is inconceivable to me that what they witnessed was a scam or a hallucination or anything else. You explain it. You explain how these guys went from fearfully hiding to preaching on the street corners of Jerusalem to the same guys who had killed Jesus, knowing that it would risk their life to preach. And basically, because their sermon was this: hey guys, you killed him, God raised him up. Tough to be you, right? What are you going to do about it? They went and challenged them on the streets of Jerusalem weeks after Jesus had been executed and then raised from the dead.
I think that's a really, really big point, that we're not talking about something that has years later where this story kind of grows in legend or is concocted. It's happening immediately following the death of Jesus. It's right up close. There's time for people to prove this wrong. There's time where this is still very relevant on everyone's minds. Everyone is very aware of this. There's too many other eyewitnesses of Jesus dying to then make up some sort of another story. It's way too familiar. These guys are in this space. It's a story right off the bat, and they made themselves incredibly available. They didn't run off to some far distant place from Jerusalem and start circulating these stories where it all kind of grew elsewhere. They did it right in the heart of where all this took place. These men didn't even live in Jerusalem, but it looks like they moved to Jerusalem immediately following all this, and they do it right then and there. They make a really big deal about it on site, where again, everyone has the opportunity to prove them wrong, and they're not hiding. They don't run from the opportunity to be corrected or called out for what it is that they're claiming. They're out in the open for everybody to engage with.
In fact, Peter and John preach. They get arrested, thrown into jail, released. They go back to the street, start preaching again. Okay? They're not hiding.
There's the one scene where the Sanhedrin is meeting and they're talking about what to do to punish them because they think that they're still in jail. And then someone comes in and they're like, they're back in here preaching again. Like they haven't even resolved the first account and they're already back in place preaching again, going right back at it.
Go figure. Now, I've actually gotten to the third kind of evidence. I've gotten to the third. Eyewitness is the second piece. The third piece is the circumstantial, which is the sudden radical transformation of the disciples. Bottom line, guys, a guy named N.T. Wright has studied this in a whole lot of detail, and some other guys have followed in his footsteps on this. Nobody in that world expected a resurrection in the middle of time. Some of the people expected a resurrection at the end of time, like we do. Someday he's coming back. When he comes back, things are going to change, right? That's a resurrection at the end of time. Nobody in that world expected a resurrection in the middle of time. Greeks, Romans, they wouldn't have expected a physical resurrection at all. They thought the spirit was what was valuable. The body was a husk. The spirit would leave, the body would go away, and then they'd be freed from this body. They didn't expect a physical resurrection. The Jews thought that there was going to be a physical resurrection someday, but not in the middle of time. The idea that the disciples were sitting there waiting for Jesus to come back was crazy. Every single one of them, and it's what the stories tell us, and it's what you can expect to have happened, when Jesus died, they were dead inside. Their hopes were dead. They had come to the conclusion that he was probably the Messiah. Messiahs don't die. It was over. They were in hiding. I made this point on Sunday morning. It's Sunday morning, he had said, in 3 days I'm coming back. He had said repeatedly, in 3 days I'm coming back. 3 days later, they were not there. Nobody was there. His mom wasn't there. The ladies who had followed him around weren't there. The disciples weren't there. His brother wasn't there. Mary Magdalene was there to cry, not to see him come back. Nobody was there. They were all as depressed and as broken as you can imagine a person being. And within weeks, they're standing on the street corner saying, God raised him. Okay? And there's salvation in his name. What are you going to do? The transformation of these guys, you explain it. How do you go from hiding to the street corners of Jerusalem in 7 weeks? What happened to make that change? Okay? That's some of the most powerful evidence to me. And it's not just the radical transformation of his disciples. There were skeptics too. Now, understand, if I were choreographing the resurrection, I would have had a lot more fun than God did. Okay? I would have sent him to Pilate. I would have sent him to the Sanhedrin. I would have sent him to the Roman soldiers who crucified him. I just had a good time, right? Kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm back, right? Wouldn't you love seeing that over and over again in these different scenes and watching their faces? That'd be so cool, right? Jesus didn't do that. On the other hand, there were a couple of occasions. His brother did not accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah. He was extraordinarily skeptical. And one of the things that Andy Stanley says frequently, he says, what would it take for you to convince your brother that you're the Son of God? Do you have a brother? Do you have a sister? What would it take for you to convince your brother or your sister that you're the Son of God or the daughter of God?
My sister already believes.
The only person in my family who came close to that was my mom, who thought I could do no wrong. My dad knew a whole lot better. Right? But the whole thing is that James, who was a skeptic, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem and died for his brother. Martyred for Jesus. You explain it. How does that happen? He was a skeptic, right? Turning around cost him his life. Why would he do that? The Apostle Paul is the oddball in this group because this was later and it wasn't a physical appearance. This was an appearance that was very, very much more spiritual. But he's on the road trying to track down Christians to lock them up or kill them. And he has an experience with Jesus, which is the only reference that I'm aware of, other than James, which is marginal, where Jesus appeared to an enemy. Because God doesn't ordinarily, rarely, ever forces himself on anybody. He gives us the freedom. He gives you enough for you to believe, but he never forces you to believe. He will someday, but until then, he leaves it up to you. But he appeared to Paul. And Paul, struck blind, had an encounter with Jesus, was baptized a couple days later, and spent the rest of his life preaching Jesus. at a radical personal cost. He describes what it cost him in 2 Corinthians, all the stuff that he went through because he was preaching Jesus. It is stunning the number of times he was stoned and beaten and imprisoned, finally head cut off, right? Preaching Jesus. The transformation, the radical transformation. And I have one other, which is the last slide, I think. Oh, I put it here. This is another transformation that you can see, and this is something that's a little bit different. It's really a different category. But some people, we read a book recently by Jeremiah Johnson. I love that name. But he was talking about the evidences for the resurrection, and one of the evidences is that wherever Jesus has been, society has morphed. The reason that the women in this room have the freedoms they do, whether you believe in Jesus or not, your freedoms are there because of Jesus. Okay? Look at how women are treated wherever Jesus has not had an influence. Compare. You see the difference. Okay? The whole idea of generosity. We have a generous bucket. You know how stupid a generous bucket would have been in the Roman world? The first people who gave without any expectation of return were Christians because of Jesus. And the generosity of a culture that is semi-civilized is because of Jesus. Because without Jesus, they don't get there. And you can go down through marker after marker after marker. We are the ones who started the hospitals. We are the ones who started the schools. We are the ones who started all of the aid societies and these sorts of things. We are the ones who brought that positive in. We are the ones who the reason that women have any rights at all. They blame the church for holding them back. They're idiots. Look at their history. Okay? Transformation, where Jesus has at least been nodded towards. You see this transformation taking place. I think that's because he was the Son of God, showing us what it was supposed to be like. Incredible power.
Surely someone has a question. All right.
Can you go for 5 minutes?
I could, but there's no need. You've done so well. I would just repeat what you've said. Uh-huh. Rabboni.
Your slide said Hebrew with the language. You looked at the NIV and ours said Aramaic.
Aramaic or Hebrew, Rabboni.
Are they two languages related?
Very, very similar to each other. I did not go back and double check. Rabboni and rabbi are close. One of them, I think, is a little bit more of an intimate term, a little sweeter term. But I did not go back and check that, Rusty, so I am not sure. Right now, I'm just speaking. My guess is that it was Aramaic, if it's a direct quote and not a translation. Because back then, these people would not be speaking Hebrew to each other except in the synagogues. They'd be speaking Aramaic. That was the language of Israel at this time. Okay? But the languages are so close. Hebrew and Aramaic are so close. I don't know if the difference of Rabboni and Rabbi is Hebrew-Aramaic. I think it's more just a variation of the term that expresses intimacy. But I can find that out real easy.
Great question. That wasn't long enough, though. What we got? All right. Yep. I'm starting to think you guys are siding with Doc. All right. Thanks for coming, guys. We're glad that you're here. We're going to pray, close it out. We'll see you again Sunday. God, we thank you so much again for this evening. Again, the opportunity to just study and to honor you in this. God, I pray that these activities that we do on Wednesday night are not just something to fill our brains, but it's something that makes us better disciples of yours, that makes us better ambassadors of yours, that makes us better representatives of yours. That this does not just become something that inflates ourselves, but is something that motivates us to represent you in the world we live in very well. God, give us eyes to see and ears to hear what you've given us. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear those that you've put in our path that you've called us to reach. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.